He thought he was meeting someone for a date. Instead, he invited his killers into his home. What happened inside that house, while his family was just upstairs, will haunt you. This is the shocking case of George Levin and the dating app predators who ended his life. Chicago, January 2025. A bitter winter wind sweeps through the quiet streets of Norwood Park. Families settle in for the night, the glow of streetlights flickering against the frost-covered sidewalks. Behind the doors of a modest brick home, a man swipes through his phone, completely unaware that his next match will be his last. George Levin wasn't reckless. At 63, he had lived enough life to be careful. He had a routine, a family who loved him, a successful career in interior design. But like so many others in this digital age, he turned to a dating app for connection. A harmless decision, or so he thought. He met someone. The conversation flowed. Plans were made. A meeting was set for that evening. A familiar dance in the world of online dating. But what George didn't know was that the person on the other end of the screen wasn't looking for love or companionship. They were looking for prey. At precisely 8:17 p.m., two men entered George's home. They were invited in. Laughter, small talk, drinks poured. But behind the smiles, behind the casual banter, something darker simmered beneath the surface. The air grew heavier, thick with unspoken intentions. And then it began. The sounds of struggle, a body hitting the floor, the muffled cries of a man fighting to stay alive. While just upstairs, his family sat completely unaware. At 8:42 p.m., the same two men left. Their pockets were heavier, their hands were clean, and George Levin was gone. Moments later, his sister would walk downstairs and step into a nightmare she would never wake up from. The crime scene would send shockwaves through the neighborhood, and detectives would soon uncover a trail of digital footprints leading them straight to the two men responsible. But here's what's even more disturbing. George Levin wasn't their first target, and he wouldn't be their last. This wasn't just a robbery. It wasn't just a senseless act of violence. This was a pattern, one that had played out before. And if they hadn't been caught, it would have happened again. But what actually happened in that basement? How did George go from welcoming his guests to fighting for his life in a matter of minutes? And what was it that finally gave these men away? To understand that, we need to go back to the beginning. Because the truth behind George Levin's final night is far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. George Levin had spent most of his life designing spaces, turning empty rooms into something beautiful, something lived in. A respected interior designer in Chicago, his work graced high-end homes, office buildings, even luxury hotels. He had an eye for detail, a mind that appreciated structure, order. But in his own life, there were empty spaces he hadn't quite filled. At 63, George lived alone in his basement apartment in Norwood Park, a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood on Chicago's northwest side. It was a safe area, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked during the day, where neighbors waved to each other from their porches. But safety is often just an illusion. George was well-liked, well-respected, a man with a successful career, a family who loved him, and a good life. But at the end of the day, when the work was done and the house was quiet, there was a loneliness that settled in. The kind of loneliness that makes the silence feel too loud. So, like many others searching for connection, George turned to the digital world. He wasn't new to dating apps. He had used them before, met a few people, had some good conversations. He knew the risks, of course. He was careful, selective. But no amount of caution can protect you from a predator who knows exactly how to make you feel safe. That's how they got to him. Jefferson Ubila Delgado and Guiderwin Bello Morales, ages 29 and 21. Two men, thousands of miles from home. Originally from Ecuador and Venezuela, they had arrived in the United States recently, slipping into a new city, a new life. To most, they were just another pair of young immigrants trying to find their footing. But beneath that surface was something else. Something calculated. Something hungry. They weren't here to build a future. They were here to take. And in the digital age, finding victims isn't difficult. It's just a matter of knowing where to look. Dating apps had become their hunting ground. A perfect setup, instant access to people's trust, their private lives, their homes. With the right words, the right profile picture, They could become anyone. A charming stranger, a potential friend, a promise of something exciting. To George, they were just two young men looking for conversation. A simple meetup, a drink, maybe, a way to pass the time. He had no idea who they really were. January 26, 2025. A cold, still night in Chicago. George sends the address. A confirmation message pings back. The plans are set. The conversation is light, easy. There's no tension, no warning sign. At 8:17 p.m., a car pulls up outside. The doors open. Footsteps crunch against the frozen sidewalk. They approach the house, and George Levin lets them in. At 8:42 p.m., the same men walk out. Something is different now. Their hands are clean. Their pockets are not. And George Levin will never walk out of that house again. But what exactly took place in those 25 minutes? What was said? What was done? And why? When George's sister went downstairs just moments later, did she still have no idea that the man she loved was already gone? The truth is about to come out, and it's darker than anyone could have imagined. Now, how the crime unfolded. At 8:17 p.m., a white Lexus slows to a stop in front of a quiet house in Norwood Park. Two men step out. One adjusts his jacket, the other checks his phone. They say nothing to each other. They don't have to. George Levin is waiting downstairs. The basement door clicks open. A brief exchange. A handshake. Smiles that don't quite reach the eyes. The kind of moment that, if frozen in time, would look like nothing more than a casual meeting. But time doesn't freeze. It moves forward. And in the next 25 minutes, everything changes. The door closes behind them. At first, everything is normal. Drinks poured. Light conversation. But then, something shifts. Maybe it's a hesitation in George's voice. A sudden change in their energy. Maybe it's nothing obvious at all. Just the slow, creeping realization that something feels off. And by the time George understands what's happening, really understands, it's already too late. The first movement is fast, brutal, a struggle, a hand around his throat, a knee pressed hard against his ribs. The kind of violence that comes not from desperation, but from control, from planning, from the certainty that no one is coming to help. They work quickly, electrical cables around his ankles, duct tape ripping from the roll, binding his arms behind his back, the pressure of the tape against his skin, tight, unrelenting. Then, the sock, forced into his mouth, the taste of cotton, of panic. Another strip of tape, wrapped around his head, sealing it in place. His breaths are short now, shallow, his heartbeat slamming against his chest, too fast, too loud. They could have stopped there, taken what they wanted and walked away. But they don't, because this was never just about money. One of them grips the back of his neck, shoves him forward, a blow to the head, then another, and another. The room starts to tilt, the world around him narrowing to a single point of pain. Then, darkness. Upstairs, his family is just a staircase away, oblivious. A television hums softly in the background. A kettle whistles on the stove. A night like any other. Few minutes later, that's when George's sister hears something. A sound, faint, coming from below. She hesitates, listening, then moves toward the basement door. Her fingers wrap around the doorknob. A breath in, a breath out, and then, a figure in the dim light. Bello Morales, standing in the hallway, calm, too calm. He doesn't panic, doesn't try to run. Instead, he meets her eyes and tells her exactly what she wants to hear. George is fine. A simple sentence, said with certainty, said with just enough confidence to make her doubt herself. And for a moment, just a moment, she believes it. She steps back, nods, returns upstairs. The basement door closes. 8:42 p.m. The same white Lexus pulls away from the curb. The men inside are quiet. No rush, no panic. As if this was always the plan. As if they've done this before. As if they know that by the time anyone realizes what's happened, they'll be long gone. But something isn't right. A text. A single message sent from George's phone. But the words don't sound like him. A gut feeling. A whisper of doubt creeping in. His sister's hands tremble as she reaches for the doorknob again. This time, the basement is silent, and when she steps inside, she sees him, unmoving, bound, and the man who had just told her everything was fine is nowhere to be found. What happened in those final moments? And more importantly, who really were the men that just walked out of that house? The basement is cold, the air still. George Levin doesn't move. His sister's voice catches in her throat. Her mind refuses to process what her eyes are seeing. She stumbles forward, calling his name. No response. She reaches for him, hands shaking, heart hammering. The tape around his arms is tight, too tight. His body is slumped, motionless, bound in silence. Then, a terrible realization. His chest isn't rising. The panic sets in fast. Her voice rises, shaky, desperate, as she calls for help. Footsteps rush down the stairs. More voices. A flurry of movement. 911. The words come out in gasps. A man, unresponsive, not breathing. The dispatcher's voice is steady, asking questions, instructing her on CPR. But she knows. She knows before the sirens wail in the distance, before the blue and red lights paint the walls of the house, before the first responders kneel beside him and confirm what she was too afraid to say out loud. George Levin is gone. The paramedics do everything they can, but there's nothing left to be done. Time of death, 9:14 p.m. For the people who loved him, everything stops. But for investigators, this is just the beginning. Because now, there's one question that needs to be answered. Who did this? And why? The investigation then begins. The crime scene is processed immediately. Photographs, measurements, bagged evidence. The basement, once a place of comfort, is now a forensic puzzle. Detectives move fast. They don't have a choice. Because whoever did this, whoever tied George Levin up, left him struggling for breath, and walked out of that house like nothing happened. Thought they were in the clear. They weren't. Surveillance footage from earlier in the evening tells investigators exactly where to start. 8:17 p.m. Two men enter George's apartment. 8:42 p.m. Those same two men walk out. Calm, collected, gone. The grainy footage doesn't hide them, doesn't mask their faces. It only takes hours for their names to surface. Jefferson Ubilla Delgado, Guiderwin Bello Morales. Two men, new to the country, no known ties to George. But the link is found quickly, a dating app. Investigators dig through George's phone, tracing messages, digital footprints, every piece of data that tells the story of how this night came to be. Grindr, a chat, a meeting arranged just days before. And then, another discovery, George's credit card activity. Because after they left his apartment, after they walked away from his body, Ubilla Delgado and Bello Morales didn't just disappear. They went shopping. Over $4,000 spent. Electronics, high-end clothing, a spree, like they had all the time in the world, like no one was looking for them. But they were wrong. The case breaks fast. Within 48 hours, an arrest warrant is issued. Ubilla Delgado is found first, picked up at a hotel, his white Lexus parked just outside. Bello Morales is found hours later, hiding in an apartment across the city. Both men are taken into custody, but even in handcuffs, they don't seem worried. Because in their minds, the real game is just beginning. And what investigators uncover next will leave everyone wondering, was this really their first time? Or just the first time they got caught? The arrests happened fast. But for George Levin's family, for his friends, for the community that once felt safe, there's no such thing as justice being swift. Because no matter how quickly the suspects are taken off the streets, no matter how many headlines confirm their capture, George is still gone. And now, the question shifts. Not who did this, not how they were caught, but what happens next. Inside the courtroom, Chicago's Cook County Courthouse is no stranger to high-profile cases. But when Jefferson Ubilla Delgado and Guiderwin Bello Morales step into the courtroom for the first time, the weight of their crime fills the air. Two men, shackled at the wrists, expressionless. The charges read out loud. First-degree murder, robbery, felony restraint. Each word lands like a hammer. And then, the prosecution lays out their case. They don't hold back. They described the brutality, how George Levin was tied up, gagged, left to die in his own home, how his killers didn't hesitate, didn't flinch, how they walked out of that basement and went on a shopping spree. The judge listens, then speaks, and in that moment it's clear there will be no leniency here. Bail is denied. Both men are ordered to remain in custody. For George Levin's family, it's a small relief, but the trial hasn't even begun, and the real fight for justice is just getting started. The ripple effect follows. Norwood Park isn't the kind of place where things like this happen. It's quiet, residential, a neighborhood where people leave their doors unlocked, where neighbors know each other by name. Or at least it was. Because after January 26, 2025, everything changes. People talk in hushed voices. They check their locks twice before going to bed. They wonder, was George targeted randomly? Or was this part of something bigger? For those who knew him, the grief is unbearable. George wasn't just a name in the headlines. He was a brother, an uncle, a businessman who took pride in his work, a man who loved design, who spent his life turning houses into homes. Now, his own home had become a crime scene. And for the LGBTQ+ community, the fear cuts even deeper. Because George met his killers on a dating app, and suddenly, what once seemed like a safe way to connect feels like a loaded gun. Local advocacy groups step in. Discussions spark about online safety, about the risks that lurk behind the anonymity of a screen. News outlets run stories. How to protect yourself on dating apps. Signs you might be walking into a trap. But for George Levin, the warnings come too late. And for his family, no amount of awareness campaigns, no courtroom verdicts, no legal victories will ever bring him back. Still, the trial looms ahead. And what the prosecution is about to reveal will make it clear this wasn't just about money. This was something far darker. And the worst part? George Levin wasn't their first target. And he wouldn't have been their last. The trial will end. The courtroom doors will close. And the names Jefferson Ubila Delgado and Guiderwin Bello Morales will fade from the news cycle. But for George Levin's family, the sentence is permanent. There are no appeals, no parole hearings, no second chances. Because George's story didn't end in a courtroom. It ended in a basement, bound, gagged, surrounded by walls that had once been his safe place. A place that should have protected him. Instead, it became his tomb. And that's the part that lingers. Not just the crime, not just the arrests, but how it happened. How a single conversation on a dating app led to a final, irreversible moment. How the same technology that promises connection can be used as a weapon. Some will say he should have been more careful, that he should have known better. But that's not the point. Because George Levin wasn't reckless. He wasn't naive. He was simply looking for companionship. And in that search, he encountered two men who saw him as nothing more than an opportunity, an easy mark. And if it wasn't George, it would have been someone else. Maybe it almost was. Maybe there's someone out there, watching this right now, who dodged a bullet without even realizing it. Maybe the profile you swiped past, the one that seemed just a little too eager, a little too polished, a little too perfect, wasn't a date at all. It was a trap. That's why this story matters. Because what happened to George Levin wasn't an isolated incident. It was a warning, one that too many people won't hear until it's too late. So now, the question is, what can you do? First, be aware. If you're meeting someone from an app, tell a friend. Share your location. Meet in a public space first. Second, trust your instincts. If something feels off, if someone pushes too hard, if details don't add up, walk away. Third, speak up. If you've ever had a close call, if you've ever felt that gut feeling telling you to run, drop a comment below. Your story could save someone else. Because in a world where predators hide behind screens, staying safe starts with staying informed.